As Jonathan said, my name is Anne Veitch and I'm the British Council's lead for English as a Medium of Education, sometimes referred to as English as a Medium of Instruction, or EMI. I'm extremely privileged to be joined today by 4 leading academics in the field of English in higher education: Helen, Nicola, Heath and Kansaku. Nicola Galloway is Senior Lecturer in Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages at the University of Glasgow. She was awarded 2 British Council research grants to examine EMI in East and Southeast Asia, and has been involved in consultancy projects with the University of Tokyo to develop a series of massive online open courses on EMI for faculty development. She's published extensively on EMI and leads a global network called Teaching English and Teaching in English in Global Contexts. I'm also joined by Helen. Helen Versterkman works at the University of Auckland, where she teaches courses on discourse analysis and English for Specific Purposes, or ESP, on the MTESOL programme. She's also widely published and has written books on ESP and edited a Routledge multi-volume work on English for Academic Purposes. Heath Rose is Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Oxford, where he's Course Director for the MSc in Applied Linguistics for Language Teaching and Coordinator of the English Medium Instruction Research Group. He's author of several books on the topic of language teaching and research methods, and is co-editor of a Cambridge series on language teaching. We're also joined by Kansaku. Kansaku Yoshida is recently retired from his role as Distinguished Professor and Director of the Sophia University the Sophia University Centre for Language Education and Research, and is Honorary President of the Icon Foundation of Japan, President of the Airline Pilots English Proficiency Assessment Committee, and Vice Chair of the Japan Council for Teaching of Foreign Languages. Throughout his esteemed career, he's held various positions, including trustee of the International Research Foundation for English Language Education, member of the Executive Committee of Asia TEFL, President of JShine, and Chair of the Strategic Committee to discuss English language education for the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education. I'm going to come to you first, Kansaku. Could you tell us a little bit more about your interests in English as a medium of education and assessment?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. I have been working for a very long time here in Japan, in Tokyo, at Sophia University. I retired, as was mentioned, in March of this year, and I spent 47 years of teaching at Sophia, which is quite a long time. And during that period, I have always been interested in using English not simply as the object of learning, but as a tool to learn something else. And so ever since after I returned from the University of Michigan to resume my teaching at Sophia in the early 1980s, I started teaching my content courses in linguistics, psycholinguistics, and bilingualism, all in English. Gradually what happened was that the basic philosophy of how English should be taught in Japan moved towards the so-called globalized view of how Japan should contribute to the world. And in that sense, the government began to seriously think about including English not as an object, but as a tool to do more academic work and also more practical work as well. And from the 1990s on, different universities began to create what is now the Centers of Language Learning and Research. We built our center in 1999 as well. And I became the first director of it. And from 2012, the present Center for Language Education and Research was instituted, and there the main philosophy for teaching English became CLIL, a Content and Language Integrated Learning. And so in the center for all of the students at Sophia University, which amounts to about a little more than 10,000 students, the basic philosophy is to try to get the students to use English for the purpose of learning something else. And now at Sophia, we also have different kinds of EMEs, programs where graduate degrees and so forth can be attained simply by attending and taking courses solely conducted in English. And so we have a very large group of teachers who are able to conduct their courses in English, both Japanese and non-Japanese. And we also have a large number of students, of course, both Japanese and also foreign students who are studying at Sophia as well, who attend these courses together. And so that's the way we are at Sophia. And as I said, the whole country is moving in that direction. And we have what's called the super global universities, which have been given subsidies by the government to promote the inclusion of English as a means of instruction within our programs, and to promote different programs where degrees can also be conferred on the students simply by taking courses in English. And this number is growing quite high at the present time. I think according to Howard Brown, he mentions that about 1/3 of all the universities in Japan at the present time already have some form of EMI or EME as a part of their curriculum. Now, of course, the quality of these programs and the courses probably are quite diverse, but at least things are moving in that direction. So I guess maybe, would that be a good introduction?
That's fantastic. We look forward to hearing a little bit more about Japanese context and Sophia University. Helen, could I ask you to tell us a little bit more about your research and interests in this area?
Hi, everybody. Nice to be with you today. Listening to Ken Sako, it just made me realize that I've spent my entire working, teaching life really involved in English medium education one way or another, although we didn't use the term English medium education at that time. I spent many, many years, 16 years working as an ESOL teacher in Turkey, working in the universities, preparing students with their English language needs for studying their disciplinary subjects in English in the universities there. Not all universities were teaching their disciplinary subjects in English at that time, but the universities I was teaching in were. And, you know, this has had a very long history in Turkey, EMI, although, as I said, we didn't use that term. And then I worked in the Middle East, working in Kuwait at the University of Kuwait in the engineering faculty. And again, the engineering faculty was all taught through English, although Arabic was the language of the first language of the students and nearly all the teaching staff. So again, I was working in English for academic purposes there, preparing students really and supporting students for their studies in engineering. After that, I moved to New Zealand and I became an academic, and I've always been very interested in English for specific purposes and English for academic purposes. And although for many years, the connection really between EAP, ESP and EMI, English medium instruction, wasn't really that clear, even to me. But recently, I've sort of become very interested in the topic of English medium instruction again. And I've done some research really looking not so much at assessment, although assessment comes into it a bit really, but looking at what happens during English medium instruction when students are in the classroom, in the content classroom, in their disciplinary subjects, the sort of classroom interaction. And looking at that, my research has found that there are a lot of interludes during that content teaching where the lecturers, the teachers or the students do take time out from dealing with disciplinary content to talk about language. And during this, there are many, many opportunities for students to, you know, directly focus on language elements, very often vocabulary of the discipline. But that's interested me a great deal. And one of my recent PhD students, Jie Hong, was looking at this topic in South Korea and found, again, lots of opportunities in classroom interaction. And she was looking in university situations and in high school situations for students to look directly at language, lecturers to correct students' language, even though they're, you know, lecturers in accounting or computer science, they were busy highlighting language, correcting their students' use of disciplinary language in the classroom. And her PhD thesis, Jie Hong's PhD thesis, included an element where she assessed the learning that students got from these informal opportunities during classroom interaction. So those have been some of my experiences and my personal voyage through English medium instruction. It's really thrilling to be with you all this evening.
Your research into classroom practice sounds fascinating. I look forward to hearing more about that during our discussion. Heath, could you tell us a little bit more about what you've been researching recently and what your interests are in this area?
Okay, thank you so much, Anne. I think my first foray into English medium instruction is a quite similar story to Helen's, actually. That first it was a professional, you know, thrown in professionally into EMI without it being a research field that I was engaged in at that time. So before moving into academia, I worked as a language teacher for 15 years, the last 5 of which was in one of Japan's first bilingual business schools, where the students had to take elective EMI courses in business in their senior years. And so our jobs as EAP and ESP teachers was to prepare students for taking those courses and prepare students to do business internationally in English. And so we had to work quite closely with the business professors to really, in terms of our assessment of those courses, that students had the competence to either enter EMI courses and succeed, or go out into the workplace and conduct business internationally. And so, you know, for 5 years, we worked quite closely with business professors to develop those preparatory and in-sessional, so concurrent EAP courses to support students. And so, as I mentioned at that time, EMI was more of a context that I was working in, and it did sometimes form a context of the research that I was conducting, but it was not the topic of research that I was conducting in itself. And so really, it probably wasn't until 2015 that my interest shifted to looking at EMI, not just as a context, but actually as a topic of research in itself. And mainly that was because I moved to the University of Oxford, where they had quite a strong research group that had interest in EMI. And because of that professional background of mine, I thought it was a good opportunity to tie that past experience and the other topics I was interested in. You know, I was always interested in globalization and language teaching with EMI. And because of that connection to Japan, so I'd lived in Japan for about 11 years. Naturally, some of the first EMI research I conducted was in the Japanese context, often in collaboration with my former colleagues at the university that I used to work at, to actually start gathering data in terms of, how those courses that we had developed and my colleagues had continued to develop had prepared students for their business studies in English. And so some of those projects that I've been involved with have focused on Japan. Those projects in Japan have mainly been very outcome focused. So looking at questions, for example, about what kinds of elements predict success for students in later business studies. And we've looked at, for example, among other variables like proficiency, but actually how well they perform in their EAP preparatory classes and whether that actually does seem to lead to greater success in business classes in the future. So that's one area that I've looked at. Another area that I've looked at is a project in China, and this was a British Council China funded project, which looked at, this was more of a policy and practice study. And so it looked at policy in 60 universities to look at how EMI was being implemented across universities in China in their drive for internationalization. So we found that EMI was, had kind of dual roles, that it was both looking at internationalizing Chinese university, but more kind of local drivers as well to kind of prepare a local domestic student cohort for a global workforce. So that was roughly 60 universities and field work at 8. And more recently with British Council China, our team has been looking at EMI provision in lower and middle income countries, which tend to have been overlooked in some of the EMI research, which has been very heavily European focused. And so in that study, we did cover a lot of countries, admittedly at a very surface level, because there's only so much you can do when you're looking at 52 countries, but it gave us a little insight into what was happening with EMI in places, not only in Asia, but in other places around the world. So yes, that's the kinds of projects that I've been involved in recently.
Great, thanks very much, Heath. And Nicola, could you tell us a little bit more about your research interests in this area?
Hello, good morning everyone from sunny Scotland. It's very sunny here today. It was interesting listening to Heath there, because Heath and I worked together on the bilingual program in Japan. And as with Heath, my experience in EMI was first as EMI as a context. And I have been thinking recently, how have I become so heavily involved in EMI research? But my research interests stem from my interest in the globalization of English, the pedagogical implications of the global spread of English. And this is something I've become particularly interested in of late with native speakerism in EMI. I've started looking at job recruitment advertisements in Japan for EMI content lecturers that are requiring so-called native or near native proficiency. And it's a bit of a concern that we have this growing discourse within the field of global Englishes in ELT to challenge dominant discourses such as native speakerism and standard language ideology, accompanied by this phenomenal global growth in EMI. So I'm looking at the moment to increase the synergies between the two fields of research. But as with Heath, I worked as an EAP and ESP coordinator in one of Japan's first EMI universities. I was an English teacher in Japan for about 10 years, I think. And I found it extremely challenging when I worked in the EMI context, because I had absolutely no knowledge of international business. We were tasked with designing the curriculum. So as he said, working very closely with the content professors, and it was a challenging task to design the curriculum, but also to think about, the goals of the program as well, and appropriate materials, appropriate assessment, as well as activities within the classroom. So I worked in this context for about 2 to 4 years. Since returning to the UK and working on applied linguistics and masters and TESOL programs, I've moved more into teacher education. But I've started researching in the EMI context, firstly with the Japan and Chinese context with the British Council funded ELTRA study, where I conducted a large-scale needs analysis. I was very concerned with the growing provision of EMI policy that wasn't matched with a body of evidence. So what we saw was EMI policy being interpreted and implemented in various different ways. As we know, in more emerging contexts such as East Asia, it's heavily associated with English proficiency goals, but by definition, EMI had no English proficiency goal. So I started looking at conceptualizations of EMI, teachers and students' attitudes, but also approaches to EMI implementation, just really to add to the much needed needs analysis to inform policy implementation. I've recently replicated that study in the Southeast Asian context in predominantly Thailand and Vietnam, where we found very similar findings, but some new findings as well, particularly with regards to exit requirements on EMI programs, issues of access and equity, and more issues of the adoption of foreign curricula and materials. So my work really does focus on needs analysis in EMI, and also my interest in attitudes. I've done a lot of work on attitudes to language. I worked with the University of Tokyo to develop a series of MOOCs for faculty development in EMI. The first was 10 lectures on EMI. The second was a global English approach to informing EMI policy. I was awarded a JSPS scholarship to go to Japan last year, and then again this December, to continue this work for 3 months and develop a faculty development program, but we had to delay, and I've since cancelled the December and January trip, which is really unfortunate. But we have applied for funding to develop some MOOCs in the Indonesian context on the back of these MOOCs. So I've done a lot. I've got a lot of experience in Japan. I've done a lot of work in Japan and China, and more recently in Southeast Asia, and yes, with colleagues in Indonesia as well. Is that enough of an introduction?
That's fantastic. There's a really good question that's just come in from Sasi Garan. Apologies if I pronounced your name incorrectly. The question is, what would be the best way to implement EME in the East Asian context? You've all worked in various different contexts, so what's your opinion of this question? It's quite a big question, I think. Nicola, as you're on screen, do you want to go first?
I think I've responded in the chat. Just, I think needs analysis is definitely key here. What we see is this assumption that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to implementing EMI policy. Some would define an Anglophone context as an EMI context. Others would include non-Anglophone contexts. And I think what's often overlooked is the discipline-specific needs of an EMI program, that even within a context or within an institution, we need to have different approaches to implementing this policy, and we need to look at the needs of our students, the goals, but also the resources available, the materials available. So there's so many different factors that need to inform how EMI policy is implemented, but also interpreted as well. So I don't know if there's not really an easy answer, but I would say it depends. It depends on the context and also the discipline, but I'll leave it to my colleagues to add.
Kensaku, do you have any reflections on your experience in Sofia in Japan? What did you find was kind of the best model of implementation?
I agree 100% with what Nicola said right now. It really does depend on the situation and what country you are in. At Sofia, Heath has come to help us out several times with our CLIL program and so forth. And we have a good faculty, and we do have good students. But then one big point is, why EMI? And what's the purpose of it? A lot of the students don't really seem to understand why it's necessary. But we're doing it because, for one thing, the government policy, as I mentioned earlier on, is trying to get the universities in Japan to work towards a more internationalized or globalized kind of academic environment. And for that, it's assumed that EME is something which will help us to join the world in that sense. However, the actual situation of each individual university is quite different. I think in most universities, for example, even at Sofia, I mentioned earlier on that in our center, we don't really have EMI as such, because there's a lot more emphasis on language. And that's why we have soft CLIL, the soft version of CLIL, as the main form of teaching English with content to the students that we have. And so, especially in the freshman year, we try to get the students, first of all, we give them for half a year a class on EAP, English for Academic Purposes, but the main focus is on teaching the language necessary for academic presentations and so forth, plus the HOTS, the HOTS, the high order thinking skills, trying to get them to use logical thinking, analysis and synthesis and so forth, and trying to get them to use these cognitive functions along with the language that goes along with it, so that in the second term, when we introduce CLIL courses to the students, that they will be able to use the basic linguistic resources and the cognitive resources to cope with the content material that they will be coping with. The major problem, however, is that the linguistic ability of the students themselves, the students do not really improve that much within the course of 6 months. It really takes a lot longer than that. We have been working quite a lot by using assessment based on what we call TEEP, which is the Test of English for Academic Purposes. It's an EAP kind of a test that we developed, Sophia, along with the Eiken Foundation in Japan. And it's a 4 skills test, and it's used for entrance examination purposes as well. But the main focus is to try to get the Japanese students in an EFL context. Students who might not really be going abroad to study, but who will be required as a member of the International Society to work from Japan and go abroad, or meet people who come to Japan and negotiate and talk to them in English at the academic and also higher cognitive levels. And so the TEEP is an academic test. It correlates quite highly with the IBT TOEFL. A 0.85 correlation is very high, but at the same time, it doesn't cover the wide range of vocabulary and topics which are treated in tests like the IELTS and as well as in the TOEFL IBT. It's limited to the very core academic kinds of environments, which we think is necessary for students in an EFL context. Of course, not all of our students are going to be going abroad anyway, so they might not really need TOEFL. They might not really need IELTS, but they will need, probably later on, they might need to converse, as I said, and to negotiate with people who come from abroad to Japan. And in order to prepare them to do that, we have this measure, this TEEP test, as a criterion. It's all based on the CEFR scale, and it ranges basically from A2 to C1. We don't have C2 level questions at all. It only goes up to about C1, because that's probably about the range of English proficiency that is necessary for the Japanese in an EFL context. So, so we have been trying to look at Japan as a specific area to see what kind of EMI or EME is necessary for our students without going overboard and trying to include everything that that might be covered in TOEFL, IELTS, and other kinds of EME programs that might exist in other countries. And I think basically, if you try to limit the East Asian context, where most of the countries are EFL countries, similar to Japan, although countries like China and Korea and Taiwan and so forth, it seems that they're sending more students abroad to study than the Japanese. So there might be some differences there, but as an environmental context in itself, they're all also EFL contexts. So personally, I think there is something common that might be shared between Japan and the other East Asian countries, in the sense that we are all EFL. And so maybe there is some core aspect of EMI that we might be able to work on together without having to work separately and trying to figure out what's best for each country. So of course, ultimately things will change because each country will have their own specific needs. But I think at the very core, I feel that maybe there's something that we might be able to work on together. That's what I think.
Can I just add?
Sorry, Nicola, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, I think Yoshida Sensei raises a number of important points there in response to the first question. When referring to Sophia, and Heath's help there, you referred to your CLIL program, and then you mentioned that you're endeavouring to look at what type of EME is needed in your Japanese context. And I think it's really crucial to think about definitions and where on this language content continuum does a program lie. And I think that different programs will have different goals. And as we know, as language teachers, when designing a curriculum, we need to look at all the interrelated factors of a curriculum. So once we define the needs, which are crucial, it's only then that we can define the goals of our programs. Then we can start to look at the syllabus, the materials, the methodology, how to teach, and then assessment, and then how to evaluate. So I think we have to look at all the different factors involved in curriculum evaluation and design, but really to start with, as Yoshida Sensei pointed out, what kind of EME really is it that we want for this particular context? Sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand on Zoom, so I just jumped in there.
It's okay, we can interrupt each other. I'm not very good at turn taking. I constantly interrupt. Heath, I'd like to come to you a little bit based on some of the issues that Kensaku raised in terms of English language proficiency. What kind of English language proficiency do you think is needed to teach and learn on EMI programs?
That's a very tricky question, actually. And I think it really, once again, we'll see probably the ongoing comment that we're going to make is it will really depend on the program and the outcomes of the program and what kind of structures of support are there. So what kind of, so I've done a little bit, well, I've done some research on these educational outcomes in Japan. And we, in that particular context, have found there's some evidence that around IELTS 6.5, which is probably no surprise to those of us that work in universities where this benchmark exists. I might have an unpopular opinion here, but I think that obviously success in EMI is not about general proficiency alone. There's a lot more wrapped up in terms of understanding discipline-specific language that is just simply not captured in these proficiency tests. But if we are talking, so we can just put that out there first before I can continue. But I think, where these proficiency tests are used, there's some evidence that students around a B2 seem to start to find EMI easier. They have fewer challenges than counterparts that might be below this threshold. So some of the research that I've done has pointed to this being a threshold, not really a threshold, but there is evidence that people experience EMI differently above and below it. But we're always very careful in our recommendations to say that just because students have these different challenges above and below doesn't necessarily mean that we're advocating that these general proficiency tests should be used. Because actually, going back to that first question about the best way to implement EME, I think, I would agree with the first speakers to say that it really does depend on the needs, not only of the students, but the programs. And so I think if universities are really serious about EME and they put in the right kind of structures in there and the right kind of pathways for students, then students can enter these programs at lower levels and, not have programs that are there to boost their proficiency to get them above 6.5, but to actually prepare them for study in an EME environment. So I'd be very interested in Helen's thoughts on this too, having worked so closely in EAP and ESP. I'm sure she would have quite interesting things to say.
I do have a couple of thoughts.
Great.
And, Heath was thinking about the students, a general proficiency level, which equips them with the language needs of EMI instruction. But from what I understand over the years, and, I did a big project in Spain in ESP at 1.2, and I learned the same thing there too. And that was that a lot of the success of EMI programs or teaching through the English medium in universities depends on the content lecturers themselves, willingness to really be using English as the medium of instruction, because, you know, the university might say, or the government might say, or your regional board of education might say, we're doing EMI, teaching EMI. But when it comes down to it, it's the lecturer in the classroom who will be implementing or not this and will be doing it. So I think it's really crucial that countries, governments, universities, and English language teacher professionals like ourselves support content lecturers, disciplinary lecturers in doing this if they need it. And my observational research of looking at content lecturers is that a lot of them don't need any help. They're extremely good at supporting the language development of their students as they're teaching, but it's not all of them. And there are lots, I think, probably who have confidence issues themselves about their language proficiency or how to deal with language in the classrooms. So I think this would be an area that really needs to develop, you know, how can we support the content or disciplinary lecturers to help them deal with the language issues, and also recognize, I think countries, governments, universities have to recognize that not all content lecturers feel that they can really implement English medium instruction because they have worries, they have concerns about their own proficiency. And I think this is an area we can't avoid. It's the elephant in the room too. I've done my bit.
All right, Nicola, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I completely agree with Helen, and I think she's raised some really crucial points again there about, you know, the real need for consultation with key stakeholders. It's the content professors that are implementing this policy at the classroom level. So I'd completely agree there. And I think that what I found in my research is that, I mean, even we're discussing here what threshold of English proficiency is needed, but what I found in the Vietnamese context was that even if a threshold is recommended, a CEFR level, at the ground level, it's not been implemented, and there's really varying guidelines and requirements, and quite often, and very concerningly, and this relates to Helen's point about helping content professors with this challenge as well, is that quite often the students on the EMI programs were not only those that were lower academic ability wise, they didn't have the academic ability to get onto the other programs, but also English proficiency wise, but they could simply pay the fee, which was double or 3 times as much, and they were accepted onto the program. So as we know, EMI in many contexts is not only closely linked to English proficiency goals, but also with economic development and to generate for fee generation as well. So what we find is that these content professors are not only suddenly told, transition your entire program into English, but they've got students in their classroom with completely different levels of English and academic ability, a lack of materials to teach their subject in English. So there's a number of different challenges, but I think, yeah, it's not just about setting an English proficiency or recommending it, but it's discussing this with the content professors and perhaps enforcing it within institutions as well. But oh no, I don't know if I'll regret saying that.
What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of using locally developed assessment systems as opposed to international assessment systems and standards on EME programs? Nicola?
I mean, I would advocate for locally developed, but obviously that's challenging. I think that, you know, we've already had discussions about the irrelevance of large-scale proficiency tests for measuring what's taught on the programs. I know that in the context I've worked in, there's been a real criticism of the adoption of foreign curricula. It's not suitable for the students. I remember interviews with some students that were studying food science technology, and they were really concerned that all their textbooks were about pasta and bread, and that they were American textbooks. And they had a real concern about their ability to work in the Thai context upon graduation, that they did not feel they had the knowledge to work in this field. And I think this relates to materials, but also to assessment as well, and what we're assessing them on. But I think that, yeah, large-scale generic proficiency exams are problematic for a number of reasons. But I'll leave my colleagues to add further comments.
Does anyone want to add?
Well, maybe I might just go back a little bit to what Heath was saying earlier on about language proficiency and what you were talking right now about the ability of the professors to be able to present their materials, the content materials, to different level English speakers and so forth. At Sophia, one of the things that we are doing is, since we do have faculties and programs, EME, you might want to call it EME, where everything is conducted in English, and the students who come, both the Japanese as well as foreign, can get all of their credits simply by taking courses in English and get their BA degrees and also graduate degrees as well. In these special courses and programs and departments, there is a specific language proficiency level that the students have to get in order to take courses in these departments. And that's the B2 level that Heath was mentioning earlier on. However, the courses, for example, that I teach, the EMI courses in psycholinguistics and bilingual education and so forth, this is open to anybody who wants to come. So as far as my courses are concerned, there is no language requirement. And so it's basically, are you interested in this topic? If you're interested, you're welcome to come. So when the students come to my class, the very first day, because everything is done in English, some students will just come up to me and say, do you think I can follow this class? And I say, well, it's up to you to try. But you know, you can drop out anytime you want. But if you think you're interested in the topic, just persevere and see how much you can do. And I tell them that if they have any questions or anything that they need, that I will help them out on a personal level. And I think all the other EMI teachers who are also teaching courses in English, courses which are provided by the faculty in the Department of English Studies, for example, there is no language requirement. Everything is taught in English, American history, linguistics, sociology, everything. And these are all professionals in those areas. And there are both foreign and Japanese faculty who are teaching these courses. And as I said, there is no real language requirement. It all depends on whether the students are interested. They're all elective courses. They're not compulsory courses. The compulsory courses are language courses. And it's there to try to get the students to develop their language proficiency, at least up to a certain level. But beyond that, the students are free to choose whatever topic that they want to choose. And depending on the professor who is teaching the course, the English used by that professor might not be that difficult. But that's for the students to try to figure out. Our CLIL classes that we have in the center also, we don't have any language requirement. After the first year, the students are divided into different classes depending on their level of proficiency. But beyond that, there is no language requirement for the students to take any of the other elective courses that we offer them. And they're all CLIL courses. Some of them are quite high, but some of them are quite low. But it's guide them if they come and ask us what they should do. But ultimately, it's for them to make that decision. I have to attain a certain level of proficiency in order to take courses which are conducted in English. Students come because they're interested, and when they come to my classes, for example, I check their English, what's going to happen is that they're going to say, oh, I should not have come to this class. They're there because they're interested in the topic. And so I only test to see how well they have understood the topic, the content. And if their English is poor, to the extent that I can't understand them, I can't understand what they're saying, of course, that's going to count. But the main focus is going to be on content, because we don't have any language requirement. And that's something that we have to make a very clear distinction on. Otherwise, the students are going to get all mixed up. The teachers are going to get all mixed up. So we have to say this, I want you to come because if you're interested, I'm not going to be checking your English. And another interesting thing is, even though you have low-level students in these some of these classes, they can still understand the content quite well. The listening ability, the reading is okay. But when it comes to getting them to take part in discussions, it's a problem. Productive skills require a lot more cognitive weight, I mean, ability. If their language proficiency is low, that much of their cognitive space is going to be taken up by trying to figure out what word they should use instead of thinking about the content. But if they're just simply listening to the lectures, and sometimes in the EMI classes that I teach, I tell them, if you want to use Japanese in your discussions with your fellow students, go ahead. Because what's important is the content and not the language. So it's more like translanguaging to a certain extent. So you have to make that sort of subtle distinctions and get the students to understand that these are things that they are allowed to do. And there are certain things like the courses in the liberal arts where everything is conducted in English, and there is a language requirement, then things become a little different. They have to be able to take part in discussions, and they have to be able to do everything in English. And the language becomes a very important point. So I think there are many different kinds of programs that we have to think about.
It's really interesting what you've all said about effective factors. So confidence of learners and teachers being eager to attend EME programs and the impact that that has in the classroom. There's a really interesting question that's just come through from Jamie, and I'm just going to read it because it's quite a long question. So there's often a lot of discussion around the threshold level of proficiency required by teachers to teach in English, which we've just discussed. And I wonder if any of the panelists know of research looking into the optimal language proficiency distance between the teacher and the student to enable good teaching, and if that distance changes depending on the level of the students and the content, the goals, the focus of the course. So quite an interesting question there. Does anyone want to come in on that?
I and then others might want to add, or does anyone else want to go first? I don't want to.
Could we just clarify what the question is? Was it the distance between the proficiency of the student and the content lecturer?
Yeah, the student and the teacher.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I'll be quiet now.
No, Helen, do you want to go first? Helen, you can go.
No, I didn't understand the question, that's all.
No, I just wanted to say I have real concerns over criticisms of EMI teachers' English proficiency, and I think this relates to how we define proficiency in English and competency in English, and what is a competent EMI teacher. And in my opinion, there's far too much focus on English proficiency. A lot of the EMI literature focuses on, the need for teacher training for content and structures that focuses on English proficiency. We do see that many of our students are critical of their EMI content teachers' English, but also they recognize their knowledge of, we have Nobel Prize winning professors suddenly told start teaching in English. So we have, again, this relates to the goals of the program. Is it a CLIL program? Does it have a dual focus of teaching content and language? Or is the focus of the program to teach the content? So I've started looking at students and teachers' attitudes towards what makes a competent EMI teacher. And we see that, you know, so-called native or near native proficiency is not seen as an important factor. This is interesting, despite the fact that we see a lot of focus on this in recruitment institutions, job advertisements. There's also this problematic assumption that simply having obtained your PhD in a native English-speaking country gives you this immediate ability to teach in English at the university level. And I found within the universities that I visited a division between those that have obtained their PhD in a native English-speaking country and those that haven't, and even salary differences as well. A lot of the English teachers were being recruited to improve the English proficiency of content practitioners. So I feel here that the growth of EMI raises a lot of questions again about native speakerism. But in my own research, as I mentioned, you know, a native-like accent ranked very low amongst the characteristics for a good EMI teacher. So I do think we need to move away from this focus on proficiency in English for teaching in an EMI context, because it just involves so much more.
I think yes. I mean, a sort of abstract view of proficiency is probably not the way to go, but certainly an ability to be able to articulate your disciplinary content in the language will be important. So it's more the communicative competence, and to me, the ability to deal with language issues as they arise is the important thing. And even, you know, native speaker disciplinary lecturers have linguistic interludes in their classrooms too, where students struggle to understand what the lecturer said, or the lecturer didn't actually articulate the idea very well at the beginning. But, you know, it's the ability to communicate generally and to overcome these communicative difficulties that will arise for anybody and everybody. I think that's more important than a generalized idea of an abstract proficiency level. So I agree with Nicola on that.
There's a really interesting question from Ricky that came in earlier related to this. How do you see the future of EME developing? Do you see it more developing in terms of English as a lingua franca, or do you think they'll stick to kind of those native norms?
Heath?
Can you just repeat the start of that question, please, Anne?
How do you see EMI developing in the future? Do you think there will be towards English as a lingua franca, global Englishes, or whether native speaker norms will remain?
Well, I think I would challenge the idea that native speak, well, I don't know, EMI is so diverse that it's really hard to actually answer that question, because different types of programs might go in different ways. And I mean, Nicola's talked about some, you know, of the research that really points to native speakerism, but there are, you know, similarly cases where, you know, the type of EMI conducted is very grassroots already and does take a, you know, a kind of more global Englishes approach, is much more supportive in kind of multilingual approaches and supporting students, like Ken Yoshida mentioned, you know, using L1 in the classroom as a resource, translanguaging. It's happening already. So I don't think it's a matter of it being something that might be a future direction. And so I think it's just quite difficult to say, because it's just going to be so context dependent and really depends on student makeup, you know, the goals of the program, what, you know, type of EME it is. Recently, Jack Richards and Jack Pun, so Jack Pun at the University of Hong Kong, did an article in the RELC journal, and it looked at taxonomies of EME, or EMI, sorry, I'll use their term, and the term we use, EMI. And I think it's just really telling to see just the sheer diversity of EMI programs out there. And you can see that certainly some of these programs already would embody these kind of multilingual approaches. Others would be very ELF in focus because they have a very diverse international student body where English as a lingua franca is, automatically becomes the norm. Whereas others are very bilingual in focus, where there's a completely domestic student, where the teacher and all the students already share another language. And so how authentic then is English as a lingua franca when there's already a better lingua franca that's shared between teachers and students? So the dynamics are so different. I think it's really difficult to say that the field will move in any particular direction because it will probably move in all of them.
That's a really good
very okay. I hope it wasn't too vague, but
that's good. Yeah, it's good to know that you predict that we continue with a kind of diverse application of EMI. I'm going to come to a couple of questions related to the conference theme of FAIRA. Why is inclusivity on EME programs important? Keith, as you're on screen, do you want to address that?
Yeah, so inclusivity, I guess, is probably talking about areas such as access. And I think there's been some really good critical work done in context of Nepal and China, probably other places to jump in if you know, but I just know of some work done like Guang Weihu and colleagues in China and Pramad Shah in Nepal that really points to EME being exclusionary in some ways, that in certain contexts, it gives advantages to the privileged that have money and resources and maybe family backgrounds to invest in English language education. And when EME is linked to privilege and future success and jobs, which in not all contexts it is, I'd say, Thailand might be one example actually, where EME happens in probably lower tier universities, and it's not necessarily attached to the prestigious universities, but in a lot of contexts it is, not just in universities but in school as well. So Pramad Shah looks at basic education and shows, for example, girls are really disadvantaged because parents only have small pots of money to invest in education, and they will invest in their son's education more first primarily, and not their daughters. And so we automatically see gender inequalities come out of EME. Guang Weihu in China points more to socio-economic status differences, that when EME comes with a price tag, even if it's not in tuition, which it often is, as Nicola mentioned, sometimes EME programs are 3 times the price of local programs. But even when it's not, even if it's happening at local, national universities, if students need to, for example, have a benchmark of English language proficiency to enter programs, and their parents haven't had the financial resources to invest in private education and tutorship, then they're going to be disadvantaged then on socioeconomic grounds. So I think inclusivity is really important because of these kind of fundamental issues that sometimes are attached to English medium education.
What role do you think assessment has to play in widening that access?
I think
for anybody.
Yes, for anybody. Does somebody want to jump in with the assessment, or?
I could try. There's a question. I'll add to what Heath was saying there about issues of equity and access and the higher fees. As I mentioned, I replicated the East Asian, Japanese and Chinese study in the Southeast Asian context. And this was one of the key different findings in the Southeast Asian study. Equity and access was a real concern among students and staff in Thailand and Vietnam. The Thai students themselves, for example, were very aware that they were privileged to be on the EMI program. And I think this is very much in the mindset at the moment of Thai students. English was really acting as a gatekeeper to a so-called quality education. And even if we look at the terminology used for EMI in Vietnam, they're called advanced and high quality programs. So there's this, so we've called for a relabeling, and Vietnamese scholars have called for this because it's really perpetuating this assumption that, you know, quality is associated with English. So I think we need a lot more research. And as Heath mentioned, you know, Pramod has done a lot of work on this in the South Asian context, but we really need to look at issues of educational access and equity, and particularly gender as well, and looking at how can EMI be approached in a way that offers greater access to all members. And perhaps assessment is one way to look at this. I know I'm giving a lot of examples in Vietnam, but I just presented this yesterday at Heath's Oxford Symposium, so it's very much in my mind. But we found that student support, despite having exit requirements of a higher IELTS score than on entrance, the universities mostly only provided language and academic support for the first 1 to 2 years in the university, not in the 3rd and 4th year. And most of the support was self-study options that students had to pay for themselves, so extra IELTS classes. And so if we have more inward-looking approaches to EMI, locally developed exams that students, that not only fee-paying students could access, then I think this would perhaps be one way. I don't know if that was an answer to that question.
Yeah.
Can I add something? And I'm going to go a little bit against, down a different avenue of thought here, but EMI to me, it actually opens doors and gives access to people. And I think one of the great things about EMI is, you know, the knowledge, disciplinary knowledge that formerly may have been only accessible to few people in English-speaking countries, to access this disciplinary and content knowledge in engineering, in science, in humanities, now is opening up to more and more people, because, you know, more and more people are able to access the international literature, that, you know, English-based literature, use English internationally as a global language. So there's, in a way that, you know, it's opening up doors as well. I do understand that, you know, unfortunately, you know, in some places it's only elite people from privileged backgrounds who might be getting their foot in the door. But and that is a really important issue, and I'm not putting it down. It's really important for us to think about. But, you know, for countries, I think one of the reasons that they are implementing EMI policies is they want access to those, you know, those international funds of knowledge, disciplinary knowledge that's built up. And this is one way that more of their population can get access to that really important knowledge. And, you know, knowledge is developing very fast. And this is, I think, how EMI has really come into being in the first place.
I wonder if anyone could say anything about basic education and how far you think basic education structures, particularly in East Asia, prepare students for entering EME programs.
I think Heath will probably have a lot to add here, and Yoshida Sensei as well. I mean, I've made comments just in the Japan and China study that we really have to question whether our you know, typical high school graduate in these contexts has the ability to study their entire English major through English. So we've got lots of discussions on EMI and higher education, but yes, this has a complete knock-on effect on preparation in high school. And I think if we look at typical Eiken scores in Japan, for example, and the level of achievement there, do these students have the ability to study through English?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump into maybe to segue from the previous question to this one too, just because I wanted to talk a little bit about access, because it's really interesting listening to what, you know, I started talking about what Helen was talking about too, and I was thinking, you know, that you know, certainly the advantages that students get through English medium education are the kind of outcomes that are driving both grassroots and top-down efforts. You know, or I shouldn't say efforts, but top-down movements towards English medium education. And so what what people like Pramod Sar and Guang Wei Hu were talking about was actually then trying to look at issues of access to those programs so that they can, all students can benefit from them. And I was talking actually in a previous symposium about this maybe earlier this year, and a comment from the audience member really made me think. And they said, well, actually, it's not necessarily a linguistic issue, because the same parents that could afford to, pay for extra tuition for English language are the same parents that would just pay for educational tuition anyway, or for different schools to get into programs. So I think issues of access are not necessarily an EME issue, and are just about general issues of access to university education in general. And so I think this is something that universities, whether English medium or not, need to grapple with. Now, what were we just talking? Are you then talking about then basic education and preparedness? I think, kind of shifting tact then. If we're moving back to looking at how well they might prepare students for English medium education, probably depends on the context, but it's probably not surprising to say not particularly well, at least from an English language perspective. I'm sure they're preparing students content-wise, because that's the bread and butter of education. In some context in East Asia, and I'd really like to hear Yoshida Sensei's thoughts on this, actually, too, having worked in Japan so long. I think in places, in educational systems like in China, where you have the Gaokao entrance examination, and in Japan, I know it's different, private public universities are different, but the public ones have the Senta Shiken, so the central examination system. This has a huge kind of washback effect in basic education, where everything is geared to these exams. And so you're really showing your grammatical competence in the language, which doesn't necessarily prepare students that might be going in to actually use the language academically. But I'd actually be interested maybe in what Yoshida Sensei has to say, having worked in Japan's education system for so long and working at an English medium institution where students are coming in from basic education into that system.
Thank you. Yeah, it's exactly as you say. The center test, or it's now called the common test. We were supposed to change it. I was on the committee to change the whole system so that we would be including all 4 skills at the university entrance examination level, but it was rejected 2 weeks before it was supposed to be announced by the government, simply because the center itself cannot come up with a valid and reliable speaking test. And so it was decided that we will be using tests which are already on the market, which have been standardized, like the ACAN and the TEEP and the TOEFL and so forth, and that these will be calibrated with the CFR scores, or the levels, and so that each of these tests might have different scores, but they will be calibrated all according to the same CFR level. And so we created a whole program on that. We spent 2 years doing it, but then at the very end, people said, you got so many different tests which are supposedly measuring different things, and you're trying to say that they all are testing the same linguistic proficiency, which of course is not. And so what happened was that it all sort of flunked out, and it was all rejected. And so we're back to 2 skills. And so what's going to happen, and what is happening at the present time, is that therefore the high school students are still preparing for the 2 skills, the reading and the listening, and that's about it. Now, the individual universities now are beginning, as I mentioned earlier on, the super global universities and so forth, they are getting funding from the government to implement more globalized kinds of educational programs. And so we have EME, a lot of, as I said, close to about 300 universities in Japan have some form of EMI already. And the government is saying that although the center cannot provide a 4 skills test to the high school students, that if each individual university has the will to implement 4 skills tests and other kinds of more 21st century kinds of skills tests in their entrance procedure, that the government is willing to subsidy and to provide some funding to these universities and to encourage it. But the government has basically said, we can't do it, so please do it yourselves. And that doesn't help. That doesn't help very much, especially when you have high school students and high school teachers who are all saying, well, we'll have to prepare our students to pass a center test, period. And that test only has 2 skills. So it's not easy. But we're trying as much as we can to revise it, but it's still going to take some time.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme. We're all trying to make the best of the situation and trying to get the best learning outcomes for students. We're almost out of time. So I was wondering if any of you have any final thoughts on the subject that we discussed today of English medium instruction linked to assessment.
I'd just like to thank you for inviting us and also for this format. I think it's nice just to listen to the experiences and the expertise of our colleagues and just to discuss these issues. I find particularly with COVID and not being able to travel to conferences and things just now that, you know, we're writing and we're working, but we don't have the opportunity to think out loud or to engage in these discussions and to see some of the interesting questions coming through the live stream as well. So I personally found it very, very useful. So thank you.
Yes, I'd like to thank the audience for their questions because they really made us think. And I know on my part, I had to really struggle sometimes to work out what I did think. So it was that they were really stimulating questions. Thank you very much. And it's been very nice to meet the other members of the panel and to put faces to names. So thanks. Nice to meet you all.
Likewise, Helen.
Thank you all. The first time that I've gone out of Japan, in a sense, to talk with everybody from different backgrounds about the same topic. It was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in to say thank you too, and thank you for the organizers for bringing these 2 themes together, because I think what's come out of the discussions we've had today is that assessment permeates through all parts of, you know, education, from access and entry to basic, you know, what's happening before students enter university, to students' experiences and, you know, how they should be evaluated in EME programs as well. So it's a very important element that we need to bring more attention to.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Heath, Kensaku, Helen and Nicola. And to reiterate, thank you to our audience today for your excellent questions and participation. It's been very nice speaking to you all, and I'll hand back to Jonathan.
Thank you, Anne. And a big thank you from me to the panelists and to Anne for doing such a wonderful chairing job. I'm sure everyone watching benefited from this discussion. We only have 6 minutes left to our next panel. So quickly go and grab a cup of tea, do some stretches, and then click into our new room all about AI. You can find it on the homepage of the platform. Okay, see you there. 5 minutes. Off you go. Have a little break. Bye-bye.